Thanks for joining me today on the creation of a card I'm calling Strong Spirit. This is a very distressed product inspired by one of my favorite artists, Prince, and included a quote there at the bottom. To begin this card, I started with the stencil from Tim Holtz called Bricked, and then some molding paste, and into the molding paste I have mixed Naphthol Crimson Liquitex paint, and then also some iridescent bronze. Now I fully mixed in the red, but the bronze I kind of kept to create not fully incorporated, so it would be more of a modeled actual brick-like look, even though I knew that later in the process I was probably going to cover that up. I wanted it to look more realistic. So once I finished with that, I moved the stencil, allow that to dry, and then I wanted to create kind of a whitewash look on my bricks. So I'm taking Picket Fence Distress Paint along with a little bit of water on my craft mat, and then taking my stenciled panel and dipping it in. Wasn't quite giving me the look I was wanting, so I applied just more paint directly to the card, and then also spritzed that with a little bit of Perfect Pearls in Pearl to give a more whitewashed look. But in the end, I decided it wasn't quite the look I was going for, so I wanted to go ahead and add a little more intensity by adding Picket Fence cracked distress paint. Now my paint has gotten a little bit dried out, so I added water to it, but it was still pretty thick, so I'm using here a palette knife to kind of work with that instead of the included brush. And then once I've got that how I want it, just set that aside and let it dry, and began work on the heart. So I keep a little box called my spare parts box, and in that I had this burgundy heart that was just the right size. So I went ahead and painted it with cracked sapphire distress paint, and then applied a coat of purple stickles over the top. And once I've got that on there, I wanted something a little more grungy, so I went ahead and applied a layer of the clear rock candy distress stickles on top of that to give it obviously a little more distressed look. And you can see that part here. And just applying kind of a blob, spreading it around with my finger. And just trying to eke every last little flake of glitter out of that bottle. And now my brick panel is dry, so I went ahead and distressed it with a little bit of vintage photo and old paper, and then hit it a little bit with a light sanding, using my Tim Holtz sanding block. And then next I went ahead and created the damask panel. So using another Tim Holtz stencil, this time the Gothic stencil. And then for this one, I'm applying 3 shades of purple. The shaded lilac is my lightest value. Then wilted violet, which is a really intense true purple, which I love. It is a fantastic color. And then I also brought in a little bit more of that reddish purple, so kind of a violet purple, by applying a little bit of the Seedless Preserves distressing. Now on this stencil, it is so ornate and there are lots of tiny little pieces, so I find that what works best when applying ink using ink blending tools is more of a pouncing action than a swirl, which is what I would normally use on one of these. But I've kind of, that swirling has almost ripped out little pieces from the stencil, so I have gone to kind of more of a pounce for this. So I am just inking both sides of my panels, for both left and right pieces. And then once I'm finished with that, I applied some antique linen and vintage photo around the edges to give it some depth. But first, stamped it with the French script, which is a retired stamp from Stampin' Up, but you could really use any ledger or lettering stamp that you liked to replicate. So here I am applying the antique linen and vintage photo to my panels. And because they're separate, you'll see I kind of line them up against each other just to kind of make sure that I'm keeping them relatively close together in my color application. Sometimes I do these as one piece and then cut them apart, but with the width of the stencil, it just works better to do these as two separate pieces. And now I am just kind of getting an idea. The white piece there is about the size of my finished card. So I'm just using that as my guide to give me an idea of where I want to tear the damask pieces. And so since I kind of work with an organic process, that does mean that sometimes I end up doing some things more than once. So I'm tearing off some of my coloring I'd already done, which is fine. But I go back over with some vintage photo, and then I decided to add a little bit of that wilted violet just in the center of that damask panel, the torn panel. I really liked the way it looked. And then I'm going to go ahead and assemble this whole thing using my fantastic, always needed, close at hand ATG gun. I actually keep it on a shelf directly behind my workspace. So just adhere that down. Once I've got these damask panels where I would like them, I also added just a little bit of that wilted violet again in the center. I just really like the way that looked. Kind of give it an additional design element. And my next step was to add my glittered heart, just using foam tape here to kind of give that some dimension, and I center that in the middle of my card. And then add my wings under my foam tape and my crown that I cut with my silhouette and then used Glimmer Glam to create. At this point I decided I really wanted to add a little more wow factor, so I applied kind of a blob in the center of the diamond glaze and then spread that out with the back piece of a paintbrush. You could use a popsicle stick or a palette knife or whatever you have handy. And I try to get it relatively level, but the diamond glaze does kind of level itself. And my next step was to go on to the hinges, which these are grunge board and are from Tim Holtz, and I'm just inking those with vintage photo, popping out the little eyelets there, the little embellishments. And my next step, I'm going to distress those with vintage photo distress embossing powder. Now the key to this powder is making sure you shake it up before you use it to distribute the little crystals that are within the powder relatively evenly. So then you just apply embossing ink, apply the powder, tap off the excess, and then use your heat gun on those. Once that's dry, then you can kind of rub off the crystals that don't melt in that process. And then I like a little additional color on those, so I'm just applying a little bit of walnut stain onto those. Measuring those up onto my card. I trimmed off the excess. I had thought initially I was going to use the whole piece, but didn't. So I just adhere these with my Scotch quick dry glue. And then I also added a brad in the center of those. You'll see I used some ink pads just as a little press weight to keep those in place while they dry. And then I decided I wanted to add some brads to my wings. It would have been easier to add these before the wings were on the card, but I didn't, so I used just a stick pin to poke through the holes and then just put 3 brads, the little distress brads from Making Memories, into my wings. And then my next step, I created the sentiment and cut the shape with my silhouette cameo, and then just distressing that plain white paper with antique linen and vintage photo, and then I adhered that onto another little frame that I had cut out. And then I colored some Prima paper flowers with Fully Purple Glimmer Mist from Tattered Angels and let those dry. And then again use some foam squares to pop off my sentiment. and then add those flowers. I ended up using 2 of the dark purple that I had colored and then 1 more violet, which was in the color it came from Prima. And then I added little pewter colored pearls from Kaiser Scrapbook on the card. And then the finished size of this card is 5.5 by 7, so I created an extra large card base for that and applied my card to it. And it turned out to be something I think is pretty special and a really heartfelt tribute to one of my favorite artists. And I hope that you enjoyed watching my video today, and you can always see more videos on my channel or more information, cards that I don't make videos for, on my blog at jenniferminer.com. So thank you all so much for being with me today, and I hope you have a great day.